last week was the 1-year anniversary of Australia's first COVID case in Melbourne, Australia. Now we're 1 year on. Let's now determine as to what Australia should do for the future with fighting the COVID-19 outbreak. In the past year, we've had about 28,000 cases and 900 deaths in Australia, with 20,000 of those cases being in Victoria after that disastrous second wave that occurred. So now a question is, what do we think of the hotel quarantine system, and how can we best determine if economically this is a situation that we should keep continuing with for return travellers? So with Australia completely crushing the curve, it's important to know now that the only way that COVID's going to come back into Australia is through a hotel quarantine. So it's important to think as to how we can best reduce the risk that COVID-19 will come back into Australia. As we've known throughout the world, particularly in Europe, is that how devastating COVID-19 can be to economies, to closing restaurants, to working from home. These are important things that we need to take consideration for. So determining as to how we best use our quarantine, I've developed 3 criteria that we need to think about. So first of all, we need to think about the Australian productivity with our workers. So we currently have 12 million workers, and we need to make sure with that particular amount of workers, we need to make sure that they don't lose productivity with the hours that they are working. Secondly, we need to make sure that hospitals don't overrun, so they don't cost too much money to taxpayers and to general Australians. Thirdly, we need to make sure that the cost of quarantine itself isn't too exorbitant. First of all, we're going to talk about the cost of productivity due to COVID-19. An Australian Financial Review article has suggested that COVID-19 can cause a loss of productivity by as much as 3% on workers. As workers are staying at home to reduce their risk of getting COVID-19, they're not as productive. Alongside this article is also a Victorian University study. This Victorian University study has conclusively seen that there has been a loss of productivity of about 5 to 10 minutes per every working day that an individual will have when at home due to the pandemic. So important to note that this was actually before the stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne, which would have definitely increased the amount of unproductivity that was happening in Melbourne during that time of that stage 4 lockdown. So from the ABS, we have found that the amount of employed people in Australia is equivalent to about 12,910,000. So let's imagine that for each day, every worker has about 7.5 minutes where they're not productive. So if this worker works 20 days a week in a month, 20 days in a month that is, and they have 7.5 minutes, which isn't productive each day, and this is for all the workers in Australia, this would be equivalent to about 32 million hours of productivity that has been lost. So if we have another COVID outbreak, which hopefully doesn't happen, but if it gets out into the community, this can significantly affect Australia and the amount of productivity they have. With a loss of productivity, that means that economic growth will decrease as we're not producing as much, we're not doing as much in the economy, but also this will see wages fall. As we're not having enough demand, we're not having enough supply, we're not putting things into the economy that will help to drive wages. And the important thing to note, that is just 1 month. 1 month, we have lost 32 million hours of productivity. If this was to span for a large period of time, Australia's economy would be significantly affected. And I just don't mean that, we're not just talking about like one state, we're talking if every state, if we had an outbreak, this would be a substantial problem. And alone, absenteeism is equivalent to about $7 billion. So when people don't come to work, that is costing Australia altogether $7 billion. So you can't imagine the significant impact it will have if we have another outbreak. Secondly, we're going to be talking about how COVID affects hospitals. So in Australia right now, the Australian federal government has committed about $16 billion to the pandemic in the 2020-21 budget. With this amount of money that they're putting towards the pandemic, this will hope to see that we can maintain our numbers when we decrease them so there's no more numbers for COVID, but making sure that also with vaccines and everything ready to go, that we should be virus-free by 2021. But while we wait for the vaccines to come so that we can all be immunized, it's important to note that COVID itself is actually, according to recent studies, as we don't have accurate data yet, it is 4 times more costly than the flu. So it's important that we make sure the numbers are low for COVID. Otherwise, our healthcare could have significant problems with dealing with COVID-19. Now, finally, we need to talk about the costs which were involved with quarantining. Ever since mid last year, there's always been a belief through the New South Wales, WA, Queensland, Tasmania, and Northern Territory governments that the people who are quarantining will pay for their journey, for their 14 days in quarantine. So with international travelers paying for their quarantine, this would see that the prices are pretty low in comparison to if we were to not make them pay. But now, here gives the question now. So we've gone through the 3 criteria. So really, we're thinking about productivity. Productivity is a significant issue. If it got into where the majority of Australians live, we could be in significant trouble. The cost of that healthcare, again, if it gets into our major cities, it's really going to affect our hospitals. It's really going to affect the healthcare and the strain on the healthcare system. And thirdly, we're going to be thinking about how much the cost is. So really, there is no cost if we're making sure that the international travelers who are coming back to Australia pay their bills. So this gives the question now. So we really would probably have 2 options. We have hotel quarantine in the city, or we'll have quarantine outside of the CBDs and in regional areas. So now, the question is, what should we do? So if we have hotel quarantine, we do indeed run the risk of another outbreak happening. Like we've seen with what's happened in WA, thankfully it didn't happen in Queensland, but a case did get out to the community, like South Australia. This did see their cities closed down. It saw WA, it's now in a 5-day lockdown. With this lockdown, they are losing productivity. They will not be able to get some of the hours back for their workers. For Queensland, when they went under a 2-day lockdown, or 3-day lockdown, they also had losses of productivity. When they're at home, people are not as productive. So if we were to think about it, if we were to keep hotel quarantine, it is important that we maintain health standards. Otherwise, because if the virus comes out, then we will lose productivity. Second of all, we've also then got the costs on healthcare. If we make sure that the virus does not come out, we will be fine. And obviously the people who are sick with coming from overseas, they will be okay, they will be cared for. And we will reduce the amount of cost on our healthcare system. But again, what happens if it comes out? There's always uncertainty as to whether people might accidentally bring COVID-19 out of hotel quarantine through workers, maybe even police officers. So again, that's a thing we need to take consideration for. Thirdly, we need to take into consideration of the cost of quarantining. So yes, the costs are good. I mean, they're free. Hotels are getting money out of it, which otherwise they probably wouldn't be, which we like to see, and it's definitely helping the industry. But there's always a thing as to wonder what happens if we were to take them to regional areas. So we're taking the people who are quarantining into regional areas, so such as a mine. So for one example, I think of Howard Springs in the Northern Territory. Currently, they are isolating everybody who's coming into Northern Territory. They're isolating in a regional area. So with this being said, it'd be a wonder as to how much the cost would be to set up that area. So it can be quarantined, so you can quarantine there, but also getting planes into that area. So really, for me, this is a really interesting topic, and leave some comments down below as to what you guys think about it. If I was to be honest here, I would be leaning towards considering and maybe even implementing a strategy where we would try and divert some of our people, so some of our travelers, and putting them into regional areas, so these regional abandoned places where they could be safely kept there, and there is no risk of hotel workers, people who, giving giving COVID swabs, or who are police even there. If they're in this regional place, they can't come out. So this really reduces the spread that COVID-19 could have, and it will limit them there. So if that's the case, then we will make sure that productivity is not lost. There's no way that a businessman who, lives in Adelaide, there's no way that he can get it, he could potentially get COVID-19 from a regional quarantine facility. When I think about healthcare costs, it reduces the risk of making sure that, there's no more health repercussions. Not many more people are getting sick. And thirdly, I do think that the costs of actually setting up this facility might cost a lot. And maybe that's what's holding the government back. Because when I think of what's happened currently with the hotel quarantining system, you've seen many reports on people not having fresh air, the circulation not being good, and that's something that we really should consider. While this isn't one of the 3 criteria, you've also got to make sure people's health and safety, making sure that their sanity is good. Because, you're seeing people locked up in here for 14 days. If you allowed them the chance to be able to walk, so if they're in a regional area, they can indeed probably walk around their facility. And they probably can have a window open. So it really gives a question as to what the government should do. It's a very hard topic to navigate. And luckily enough, being in an island, we have reduced COVID-19 to pretty much 0. So we're very lucky in that situation. So I'm a bit curious as to what happens in future weeks. Will people start considering it? Will any of the other states follow what the Northern Territory is doing? They haven't had many cases in ever, or even community transmission, so maybe they're onto something. So guys, with that being said, I'm going to leave the video here. I hope you guys are safe during COVID-19, wherever you are in the world. I know as an Australian, I've been incredibly fortunate to be where I am and not having to worry as much with COVID. Yes, we did go through a lockdown in Queensland, in Brisbane, but we've been okay. We made sure that there was only a couple of cases from that UK strain that got out from that worker, and thankfully that was the case. But I hope you guys are safe, and I really can't wait till when we can start to move around again. So that being said, guys, I hope you had a good day, and I'll see you in my later videos. See ya!